Well, good morning. Well, I am excited to be able to continue this series, Summer in the Psalms. Hopefully, you have been encouraged through this. And I don't know if you know this, the songs that our team is writing to go along with the study are just absolutely fantastic. In fact, two of the three songs we sung this morning were written by our team, and they've just done a wonderful job. And it's fun to be able to sit and sing those songs, thinking about what we've been studying, what we're preaching, and just see how it all fits together so nicely. It's so good to see that truth reinforced, and we're going to continue that again this morning. We've been looking at different genres of the Psalms, and obviously this isn't a series where we're just going verse by verse, book by or chapter by chapter through the whole book. There's too much to do in just a few months. But what we are doing is looking at the different genres within the Psalms. And if you've been here for this study, you will probably remember that we've looked at Psalms of Thanksgiving. We've looked at Psalms of Kingship. We're going to be looking over the next several weeks at a variety of others. But this morning we are looking at a Psalm of Wisdom, or a Wisdom Psalm. And what's a little bit more challenging about a wisdom psalm is that within that one genre, there are different themes. I mean, and I think you'll understand what I mean by this. When you're looking at Psalms of Thanksgiving, what's the theme? Good job. All right, excellent. When you're looking at a kingship psalm, you're looking at all the psalms that are kingship psalms, all have that same theme of promoting and highlighting the fact that our God is king. When you're looking at Psalms of confession, the theme is clearly confession. But when you get to a wisdom psalm or the wisdom psalms, there's a number of them. Each one of the wisdom psalms is a different topic. And so what I've decided to do this morning, rather than trying to do an overview of all the topics contained in the wisdom psalms, is to zero in on one. And so this morning we are focusing our attention on Psalm 37. So if you have your Bibles, I invite you to turn there with me. Psalm 37. The message this morning is very, very practical. Obviously, there are times when we go through portions of Scripture and it's very rich doctrinally, and that is certainly needed. But this passage that we're looking at this morning is very, very practical. You should be able to walk out of here very easy, very clearly, be able to cling to some truths that can impact your life. This psalm addresses the topic of worry, or the topic of anxiety. And when we're talking about wisdom psalms, what the psalmist is doing, what David is doing in this psalm is he is showing us how to biblically and with biblical wisdom, with godly wisdom, respond to worry and anxiety. This is something that is a growing problem in our country. It's something that's increasing. We're going to talk a little bit more of that in just a moment. But it's almost as if David is looking around him and he sees the wicked prospering. He's looking around him and he sees the wickedness in the world. He sees all that's going on, and he realizes the worry that it is causing in people. In fact, notice verse 1, Psalm 37, verse 1. Here's how he begins. Fret not yourself because of evildoers. Be not envious of wrongdoers. You know, it's interesting, just kind of starting off in verse 1, that David doesn't try to convince us that evil exists. He doesn't try to convince us that wrongdoers exist. It's almost like it's assumed. And certainly in our day and time with media, social media, internet, we can look around and we see the wickedness in the world around us. And there's some of it that we look around and you wonder, okay, is there more to this story? You see this crime being committed and you say, is there more to this story? I wonder what the other side of it is. But then there's also crime and wickedness and evil in the world that we look at and we're like, you know what? That's just wicked. That's just wrong. That's just evil. It's almost like David just looks around. He's like, I don't have to explain that there's evil in the world. We see it. We experience it. We are witnesses to it. It's also interesting in this verse that there's kind of two instructions given that are on opposite ends of the spectrum. The first is to not worry because of evildoers. It's not uncommon to talk with people who they see all the wickedness in the world and they're almost paralyzed by it. They're almost looking at everything happening in the world and they see all the wickedness and they see the evil and they're almost afraid to go out, and they're always kind of the alarms are going off and they're always kind of on edge just looking because they're just afraid of all the evil that's around them. And so the first instruction is don't fret because of this. But the second part of the verse says don't be envious. And it's like, wait a second. How am I going to be worrying about evildoers and also be envious of evildoers? And I think what David is getting at is sometimes it seems like those who care nothing about righteousness, those who care nothing about doing what is right, those who care nothing about biblical truth, those who care nothing about aligning with what is right, doesn't it sometimes seem like everything just goes well for them? And you're looking like, how is this right? How is this fair? Why is this happening? How is it that the righteous person, the person who is trying to do what is right, seems to struggle? And the ones who care nothing about righteousness, all of a sudden, they're the ones that everything kind of falls into place. God, it doesn't look right. Maybe I should just kind of throw in the towel a little bit. So on one hand, don't worry about all the evil. But on the other hand, don't get so jaded that you get to the place where you're envious of the evildoer because it seems like everything goes their way. Now, down later in the chapter, we have this, obviously verse 1 is kind of this initial instruction. But later in the chapter, we also have kind of the testimony of David. Down a little bit later, verse 25 and verse 26, we see kind of his viewpoint on everything. If you look at these verses, here's what David says, verse 25. I have been young and now am old, yet have I not seen the righteous forsaken or his children begging for bread. He is ever lending generosity and his children become a blessing. So I want you to kind of picture this. We got a couple bookends here. All right, we have this initial instruction, don't worry about evildoers. Don't be envious of evildoers. And then later in the chapter, David says, here's kind of where all this is coming from. I have been young, I am now old, and I have never seen the righteous forsaken. So while it may seem that God is not keeping up with everything, he's in control. Now, the question is, how do we get to the place to where worry does not consume us? Obviously, the specific context of Psalm 37 is the people looking around and they see the wickedness and they see the evil and it seems like they're getting away with everything. But I think the instruction that follows verse 1 will apply to any person who struggles with worry. And I understand this morning that it is very possible, in fact likely, that there are people in the room right now that you struggle with worry, you struggle with anxiety, and for some of you it may be crippling. For some of you, it is a real challenge. One person said that worry often gives a small thing a big shadow. Another person said worry is wasting today's time to clutter up tomorrow's opportunities with yesterday's troubles. But it's a growing issue. In August of 2018, Barnes & Noble announced a huge surge in the sales of books about anxiety. In fact, there was a 25% jump. One organization estimates that there are over 300 million people worldwide who struggle with worry and anxiety. They did more research and it concluded that almost 4 times as many people struggle with anxiety in high-income countries as opposed to low-income countries. So having more stuff and having all access to everything is not the solution. They actually concluded that the United States is leading in the percentage of people dealing with worry and anxiety. Millennials were revealed to be the most anxious generation. They looked at the causes over a 40-year period of time, and the pursuit of money and fame was a significant contributor. And one of the most groundbreaking studies found a huge connection between those who struggled with anxiety and their dependence and addiction to social media. Connection. Now, before we dive into the text, I want to acknowledge that while we're dealing with the topic of worry and anxiety this morning, and I understand that many people deal with this, that we're dealing more with the common worry that impacts or is a temptation for all of us. Over the years of pastoring, I've counseled numerous people who have had crippling anxiety. I mean, worry and anxiety so severe that it would literally cripple them, to where they could not move. Their muscles would seize up. They could not move at all. I'm not as much this morning dealing with diagnosed anxiety as I am the common worry that again, is a temptation for all of us. Because are y'all worriers? I see people pointing at each other. All right, it's confession time. I also think it's important to acknowledge that there is a difference between worry and concern. When we're talking about the dangers of worry and anxiety, we're not suggesting that we should never be concerned about situations. Some people think, well, if I'm not worried, then maybe I shouldn't be concerned. There's a big difference. Worry is problem-oriented. Concern is solution-oriented. Worry distracts, concern focuses. Worry disables, concern ables. Worry blurs vision, concern clarifies. Worry tends to give up, concern perseveres. Worry exaggerates, concern pinpoints. Worries is internally focused, concern is externally focused. So when we're talking about biblically, how do we respond to unhealthy, and I would even argue at times sinful worry, how do we respond in a way that takes biblical truth into our lives and then sets us free from the worry that can control and the worry that can distract? And please understand that I'm not presenting this as someone who's got this all figured out. I remember one time, Dana and I had just been married, I think about a year and a half. We were moving from North Georgia to Northeast Ohio. There's a difference between those two. Big difference. We were living in Northeast Ohio. I was a youth pastor at a church, and I was getting ready to leave to fly to the Philippines for 10 days. I was excited. It was a mission trip. I was going to be speaking at a youth camp in the Philippines, and we were all geared up, ready to go. We were getting ready to fly out. Our flight was April 5th, and I remember that because it snowed. That's one of the key differences in Northeast Ohio. It snowed on April 5th, but the day before I'm getting ready to go, Dana calls me on the phone. And I answer the phone, and she's like, "I'm okay, but I've just been robbed." I'm like, I'm not okay now. She was working at a bank, and a person walked into the bank, pulled a gun, and jumped over the counter where she was stationed. And everybody in there had to get on the ground, and you can imagine the turmoil of that. Well, I'm looking at this. We'd just been married a year and a half, maybe 2 years at that point. I'm leaving the next day for the Philippines for 10 days. We don't have a lot of friends in that area yet, a lot of connections. We're new. We've just been there a few months. And I'm like, what do I do? God, I mean, as the husband, I want to protect, and I want to do all these things, and there's nothing I can do. And so in that moment, I was 100% worrying and 0% handling things correctly. My mind was just in a blur, panicked. What do I do? Do I cancel my trip? Do I fly her to her parents? What do I do? The reality is we're all going to go through situations that have the potential to cause significant worry in our lives. And it may not be something as momentary as something like that, like something happens in a moment. Sometimes it is something that lasts for a long period of time, and it's this ongoing struggle. And then there's some people who just naturally are more prone to worry, and everything that happens around them, they're always looking at what potentially could go wrong, and they're always worried about this situation and always worried about this, and they're really crippled in their life, and they never try anything, they never do anything because the worry is dominating them. So how do we respond to that? How do we respond when worry is very, very real, when anxiety is so real that it distracts us from what God has called us to do, and it distracts us from the life that God wants us to live? Well, David gives us a lot of clues in this answer. This psalm is very fascinating. Every other verse begins with the next letter in the Hebrew alphabet. It's a very structurally brilliant piece of writing. But what I want us to notice is, how do we respond to worry? Now, I want you to see the instruction again. Verse 1, fret not, or don't worry because of evildoers. Look down again at verse 7, halfway through the verse. Fret not, or don't worry over the one who prospers in his way. Look at verse 8. Refrain from anger, forsake wrath, fret not. Now, I've told you this a lot of times. Whenever you're reading your Bible and you see the same instruction appear multiple times, it's kind of a clue that this is the theme of this passage. So as we're reading through this and we see this idea, don't fret, don't fret, don't fret. The idea that David is trying to get across to us in this passage is, how do we get to the place where we are free from fret, where we are free from worry? The instruction to not worry is rooted in our focus. If you're taking notes, I want to give you several truths. You'll see these on the screen. Again, these are very, very practical, all right? You're probably not going to hear anything this morning that you've never heard before, but when we apply it to this, I think it can be very freeing. Here's the first truth that we see, or the first instruction that we see. Trust in God and do good. So if you struggle with worry, in fact, this is good advice for any situation, no matter what your struggle is, but if you struggle with worry, the first thing David highlights for us is the need to trust in God and do good. Look at verse 3. You see it very clearly. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and befriend faithfulness. We're going to talk more about this trust in a few minutes because this is a theme that reappears in our text. But there's something in this that is often missed. I think many of us, when we think about trusting in God, we think that that's only a mental decision that has no real impact on our actions, no real impact on what we do. What we see in this verse is there is a direct connection between the decision to trust God and how we then live as a result of that trust. Notice the verse again. Trust in the Lord. That's the decision. Trust in Him. We'll talk about more in a minute about what that means, but here's the action. And do good. See, when we truly trust in God, it is going to have a direct impact on how we live. Many times when we are consumed with worry, the response of worry and the reaction to worry is that we withdraw. And as a result of our worry, we sit there with our arms crossed or our hands folded and we become inactive and we do absolutely nothing. If there is a cognitive decision to trust in God, that decision then has to impact how we live. Notice the instruction, do good. And it goes on from there. Dwell in the land and befriend faithfulness. Or I like how the New American Standard Version translates that phrase. It translated it as cultivate faithfulness. So in those moments when you are consumed with worry, make the decision to trust God. Commit to ongoing good. Do good. Be active doing good. And in those moments, cultivate faithfulness. If you struggle with worry, instead of sitting back and worrying about what you cannot control, be active and commit to doing good. Cultivate faithfulness. There is a connection. Continually doing good and cultivating faithfulness is the proof that we trust in God. The next verse, let me go ahead and read verse 4 to you, says this. Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart. Here's the second instruction that we have. Delight in and surrender to God. So first, we trust in God and we do good. Secondly, we delight in and surrender to God. I think this verse is probably one of the most misused and understood and misapplied verses in all of Scripture. We're going to clear it up, all right? Y'all seem really excited. Delight yourself also, or delight yourself in the Lord. That's not the misused and misunderstood part. The misused part, misunderstood part is the second part of the verse. And He will give you the desires of your heart. I don't know how many times I have heard this verse used to suggest that, well, you know what? If I follow God, if I delight in God, He'll give me whatever I want. So I'm going to create this huge wish list of all these things I want. And if I just go to church and I read my Bible, then God's going to give me all these things. Let's break this verse down and be sure we understand it correctly and accurately. We have to begin with the first part of the verse. Delight yourself in the Lord. The word delight means to spend time in enjoyment, to take pleasure in, to be sensitive towards. It carries with it the understanding that this delight comes directly from communion with God, spending time with God. We seek and we find our source of happiness and joy in Him. We focus on Him. We rest in Him. We love Him. We find our joy in Him. We commune with Him. We delight ourselves in the Lord. That is the focus of our lives as we spend time with Him, and that is the source of our joy. But when that is the focus of our lives, when that is the driving direction of our heart, when we can truly stand up and say, I delight in the Lord, I commune with the Lord, I spend time with the Lord, I fellowship with the Lord, I find my happiness in the Lord, there is something that begins to transpire. There is something that happens. That next phrase, and he will give you the desires of your heart, I think there's two legitimate ways that this could be understood. One legitimate way of understanding this is that when you truly delight in the Lord, when you are truly surrendered to him, he places within you the desires that he wants you to have. He transforms your heart. He transforms your desires. It's not that you get to create a magical wish list. It's that he transforms your heart and he transforms your desires. And I think another legitimate way of understanding this is that when you truly delight in the Lord, your heart is pursuing God. Your heart is pursuing God's heart. The closer you get to God, the closer you get to his heart, the more your heart resembles his heart. The more your passions resembles his passions. The more your priorities resemble his priorities. The more your desires resembles his desires. Both of these understandings, I think, are related. They both indicate that there is a submission, that there is a conforming to God. So whether you adopt the more active interpretation that suggests that God places his desires within you, or the more passive interpretation that suggests that the closer you get to God, the more your desires align with his, what there is a need for is surrender. But the way this happens is through the delighting. The one thing it does not mean is that God is the genie in the sky that you can just make your wish list to, and as long as you go to church and do some good things, he's going to grant you whatever you want. That is not at all the meaning of this. But here's what will happen, and I've seen this. When you truly are passionate about your relationship with God, when you truly care about what God cares about, and you are spending time in his word, and you're pursuing your relationship with him, and you're striving to follow him, and you find your enjoyment in him, and you commune with him, and that is the focus of your life, and that focus infiltrates everything else. There is a transformation that happens to where you surrender to him, and your desires become conformed to his desires. And all of a sudden, now the things that you want are different. The things that you used to strive after are no longer a priority. The things that you used to want and you used to want to have in your life are no longer needed. This point that we've worded here, number 2, delight in and surrender to God, is one of those things that's easy to talk about, but it's hard to do, isn't it? I don't know how many people I've talked to over the years who they want to delight in the Lord, but they never spend time with him. Can I just say very bluntly this morning that you will never delight in a God that you do not spend any time with? Can I say this morning that your heart will never be conformed to his heart, and your desires will never be conformed to his desires if you're not spending time in his word and learning what his heart is and learning what his desires are? See, if we talk about wanting to be conformed to him, and we're talking about being transformed and our heart aligning with his heart and our desires aligning with his desires and our passions aligning with his passions and our priorities aligning with his priorities to the point to where we want what he wants, to where the desires of our heart aligns with the desires of his heart. Listen, that is never going to become a reality in your life or in my life without us committing to spending time with God. You cannot delight in a God that you do not commune with. And what is so hard, and I think what is so tempting for so many people, and what I think is plaguing the church in America, is we have people who want, on one hand, they want what God wants, but yet they're too busy and they do not prioritize actually spending time with God. And so they live this whole life where it's like this tug of war going on. It's like, I know I need to be over here, but I've got all these other things I want at the exact same time. How do I align with what God has for me? It comes through communing with God, delighting in him. And for some of us this morning, it has been a really long time since we can truly say, I am delighting in God. I'm serving Him. You know it's possible to serve God but yet not be delighting in God? It's possible to get so busy focused on everything you're doing for God that you forget about your relationship with God. It's possible to go through the motions of Christianity without actually focusing on the heart of your relationship with Him. And what happens in so many people is we're doing all of these things. We've created the checklist and we're marking everything off, and I'm going through the motions and I'm doing the task and I've got everything done. It looks like I have everything right. And even though I have all the right actions and I'm doing all the right activities, my heart is far from Him. And then we wonder, why is there the struggle? See, your relationship with God is not only about what you do for Him. It is about your relationship with Him and the time you spend with Him. What you do for God should flow out of your relationship with God. It is not a replacement for your relationship with God. And there are some of us this morning that we need to focus a little less on all the stuff we're trying to do, because in our own hearts we know all the stuff we're doing is simply a replacement for not communing with Him. There's got to be this movement back in biblical Christianity to where everything I do and all the service that flows from my life is the result of my delighting in Him. Which requires some honesty in our own hearts and our own minds this morning. I mean, the reality is, can I be blunt again? The reality this morning is there are far too many Christians who are active serving God who never spend time with Him. You know where the power comes in ministry? You know where the joy comes in ministry? You know where the peace comes in ministry? Not just through the activity, but through the relationship, through the communing, through the enjoying. So here's what happens, very practically. If you're the type of person who you have all the stuff over here you're doing for God, but yet you're not spending time in communing with God, you know what begins to creep in? I wonder if I'm doing enough. And we begin to worry. I wonder if I'm doing I wonder if I'm doing this the right way, and I wonder if I'm doing enough, and I wonder if I need to add in more, and I wonder if I have enough stuff on my checklist. And worry begins to creep into our heart, and worry begins to creep into our mind to the place what happens with a lot of people. If they don't get this resolved, they end up reserving back and withdrawing from any activity in ministry. And it's not because they're not doing the right things, it's that they're not communing with God. If you're the type of person that struggles with worry, and I think, honestly, we all have the areas in our life where we struggle with worry. You say, how do I gain victory over this? Trust in God and do good. Delight in Him and surrender to Him. And the surrender is about aligning your heart with His. This third one is tough. Commit your life to God. Now, we know these verses, and you see it in verse 5. Again, you see the action word in verse 3, trust. The action word in verse 4, delight. The action word in verse 5, commit. Look at it, verse 5. Commit your way to the Lord, trust in Him, and He will act. He will bring forth your righteousness as the light and your justice as the noonday. This is hard. Give God the reins. We often treat God as though He's the co-pilot or the backseat driver who's there to give advice. That's not the picture in Scripture. The idea is that God is the one guiding and God is the one directing. This is not about passive abandonment. This is about actively rolling your cares and your concerns and your worries about everything in your life onto Him. Cast your care upon Him. Why? Because He cares for you. The only way we can truly do this is, again, you look at verse 5, commit your way to the Lord. How can we do that? How can we give our life to Him? Well, it's contingent upon that next phrase, trusting in him. Trusting in him. The result, he will act. It's a reminder of God's faithfulness. Commit your way to the Lord, trust in him, and he will act. Now, notice that it does not say when God will act. It does not say how God will act. It does not guarantee that you will understand what God is doing. It's not even a guarantee that you'll necessarily like what God is doing. But it is a reminder that God is faithful. One of the other themes we see through the book of Psalms, and we may touch on this later in this series, is there's times in the life of David where he cries out to God and says, God, where are you? God, I'm crying out to you. I'm pouring my heart out to you. God, I don't see you. I don't know what you're doing. And one of the things that we see in God's response to David time after time is that God's silence never indicates inactivity. Even in those moments when God is silent, you can trust that he is at work. God is never inactive. God is never sitting back doing nothing. God is never caught off guard. God is never surprised by situations in your life. God is never in this circumstance that sometimes we find ourselves in. God is never in the position where he doesn't know what to do. And yes, there may be times in your life where you cry out to God in the pain and in the worry and in the anxiety, and you don't see what God is doing and you don't see his hand working. Understand, God's silence never indicates inactivity. God is always, always at work. But isn't it hard not knowing what he's doing? Isn't it hard when we think we know what God needs to do? Well, this is why this next point is so important. Number 4, stop trusting in your own schemes. This is the one I struggle with, in case you all were wondering. Look at verse 7. Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Fret not, or don't worry over the one who prospers in his way, over the man who carries out evil devices. Be still before the Lord. This idea, be still before the Lord, means to hold your peace, means to be quiet. It means to stop giving advice, stop questioning, stop telling God what you think he needs to do. Stop trusting in your ability to reason, in your ability to scheme. Just rest in him, rely on him, wait on him. Stop trying to fix the problem by yourself. Wait on God. If he is really in control and if you really do trust him, then leave it in his hands. I was watching a TV show not long ago that was set in a military setting. And they were facing a significant challenge, and the senior military officer looked at the junior officer and said, I know what needs to be done. And the junior officer says, good, maybe we could just try this or do this. And he listed off several courses of action. And the senior officer stopped and looked at him and said, I've got this. And the junior officer said, I know. And then he continued to give advice. And the senior officer kept walking, but he stopped and looked at him again and said, I'm starting to think you don't trust me. And the junior officer paused and said, I trust you completely. I was just thinking, though, that maybe we could, and he kept rolling on. I feel like sometimes that's how we are with God. I mean, God's there, and we know he's got it, and God's looking at us and saying, I've got this. And we're like, I know, but here's what we need to do next. And God's looking at us saying, I'm starting to think you don't trust me. We're like, no, God, I do trust you, but here's how we need to fix this. And we just keep giving advice and giving advice. This idea in verse 7, be still before the Lord. I get the idea that what David is telling us to do is there's times in our lives where we just need to zip it. We just need to rest. If we really trust God, then we do what this said. Now, notice this, be still before the Lord. And why do you think David tells us that we need to wait patiently for him? You know why? Because God's timetable is not always our timetable. That's frustrating. I mean, can we be honest? It's why we need to trust. Let me give you this last thing and we'll be done. Number 5, forsake anger, bitterness, and resentment. Look at verse 8. Again, we see the next action word, refrain from anger. forsake wrath, fret not, or don't worry yourself. It tends only to evil. I just want to mention this, the danger in not doing all the other things that we've talked about. When worry is left unchecked in our heart and in our life, when we look around and we see the wicked prospering and it doesn't seem like God cares, when we're worried about what we can't control, we are in danger of becoming bitter. We're in danger of resentment and anger boiling up within us. And the way this is worded, it assumes that the reader has already headed down this path. That this isn't just the instruction to avoid this in the future. This is the instruction to forsake it now. Why? Well, he's very clear. Worry, fretting, leads only to harm. It will do nothing but hurt the situation. It'll do nothing but hurt you. Listen to this quote. Worry is fear's extravagance. It extracts interest on trouble before it comes due. It constantly drains the energy God gives us to face daily problems and to fulfill our many responsibilities. Worry, therefore, is a sinful waste. A woman who had lived long enough to have learned some of these important truths about life said this: I've had a lot of trouble, most of which never happened. She had worried about many things that had never occurred and had come to see the futility of her anxieties. There's a lot of us, I think, we live in a very anxiety-filled culture. And we look around us and there are so many things in us and in our families and in our careers and in our country and in our everything that you can imagine that has reason to cause us to worry. But what we have to understand is that worry about our circumstances and trust in God cannot coexist. They're like two diverging paths, and you have to pick which one you are going to journey down. Hudson Taylor, missionary to China and founder of what today is known as the Overseas Missionary Fellowship, gave this excellent advice, and I want to close with this. Listen carefully. Let us give up our work, our plans, ourselves, our lives, our loved ones, our influence, our all, right into God's hand. And then when we have given all over to Him, there will be nothing left for us to be troubled about. So what often happens is we want to have control. And we think, well, if I turn all of this over to God and I rest in Him and I trust in Him and I wait patiently on Him and I am silent before Him and I'm just waiting on God to work. And again, that doesn't mean we do nothing. We cultivate faithfulness and we do good and we focus on delighting in Him. But we think if I turn all this over to Him, what if He does something that I don't like? Which really comes back again, do we trust God? And it's one of those things, I mean, as kids, we probably sang the song, Trust and Obey. And it's such this elementary concept, but let me tell you something. There is nothing that is more difficult for the Christian to do on a daily basis than to truly live in a position of trust and surrender before God. And until you do, all the worries of the world and all the stress of your life and all the concerns over situations and trials and difficulties and finances and career and all these things that are happening, until I can get to the place where we can truly trust Him and we're still before Him and we're waiting patiently on Him and we are delighting in Him, until that becomes how we live, we're going to have the weight of all of these things on us, and it is going to get to the place where it crushes us, and there's going to be anger and resentment and bitterness because we're trying to figure it all out and we can't. And God's design is not for us to carry the weight of all life's worries. It is to trust Him and turn it over to Him. The idea of rolling it all onto Him and then wait patiently. And I think what will happen, and there's some of you here this morning who you understand what David was saying down in verse 25. I think this can be the testimony of our lives. I have been young and now am old. Yet have I never seen the righteous forsaken or his children begging for bread. He is ever leading generosity, and his children become a blessing. This past week, we were on vacation. On the way to vacation, we went and visited my grandmother up in Mountain City, who turned 98 this past week. And even though she goes through moments where her mind is not all there and she doesn't recognize us and know us, there's moments of clarity kind of sprinkled in to where she recognizes us and talks. And I remember several years ago talking with her, and my grandparents kind of had a rough life, as many did in that generation. And I remember talking, and we were just talking about the high cost of everything. And this was years ago at this point. But I remember one time she said, God always gave us exactly what we needed. And I look at the words of David in verse 25 and 26. I was young, and I am now old. God's been faithful. You know, one of the values of having a multi-generational church is there's some of you who you were young and you're now old. And like David, you can stand up and say, you know what? You can turn your concerns and your worries over to him because he's never forsaken. And there's some of you who are younger, middle-aged, where you need to be reminded of that because you're reading this and you're like, I don't know how this is possible. You know what I do know? Worry will crush you. Trusting in God and rolling all of that over to him will free you. And there's some of us this morning that we need to roll some things onto him.